Are you curious about how restaurant lists will change in a post-COVID world? How about the role of the sommelier? Why should you care about or seek out high acid wines, and how do they do with food? And what's changing with Washington wines? What should you be looking for now? Well, you're in luck because tonight you're going to get all of those answers plus a lot more from our guest, Zach Geballe, who's here with us now, but I'm going to introduce him in a moment. If you're watching this video on the replay, please type the word replay in the comments and let me know what wine you've enjoyed lately. And if you're here with us live, I want to know that too. What's in your glass? What's the weather like where you're logging in from? You've just joined one of the most passionate group of wine lovers who gather every Wednesday at 7 p.m. Eastern to talk to the most interesting people in the world of wine. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and I host online wine and food pairing courses. All right, and I'll be live streaming this video conversation that was recorded for my podcast, Unreserved Wine Talk, on Zoom, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube. So, back to our guest. Zach Geballe is a Seattle-based journalist and educator focused on the beverage alcohol industry. He's the co-host for the very popular podcast from VinePair, as well as the founder of Disgorged Wine, a wine education and events company based in Seattle. He's a certified sommelier with 15 years experience in the wine industry, and he joins us now from his home in Seattle. Hey, Zach, how are you?
I'm great, Natalie. Thanks so much for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. I had such fun chatting with you on your podcast.
Mm-hmm.
We just had to do it again.
Exactly.
Yeah. So let's get started first with some of your most memorable wine experiences. Tell us about the time or your first experience at the Seattle restaurant Dahlia Lounge.
Well, it's funny, I served as the wine director and sommelier at Dahlia Lounge for a number of years. And honestly, my first real wine experience there probably didn't come until I was an employee, but I had such a lovely. I was a very strange child in a lot of ways, and one of the ways I was strange was that I was really fascinated by restaurants and food. And
why do you think that was as a child? Usually, kids don't want to have anything to do with the parents like accompanying them to a restaurant.
I think it was two parts. One is my father worked as a cook, both at times before I was born, so certainly not something I was aware of other than hearing a little bit about it, and then briefly as a cook when I was relatively young, kind of when he was in between other jobs. But it's not to say that I had I went with him to it was his job, and I didn't really know a lot about it. But I think I've always loved food, even before when I was a kid, before I was interested in drinks of anything sort of beyond juice or whatever. But I loved restaurants. There was something to me, I think, as a child, and I think maybe it just kind of came from how I grew up, where the rule for both of my parents in their houses was basically, what we are making is what is available, and you don't get it, what you'll eat it or you won't eat anything. And I was always a good eater, and so mostly I ate it, and I was always pretty willing to try new things and liked most things. But there was something about being the times that I did get to go to restaurants as a kid where I could order whatever I wanted. I could decide that I could eat something different than what my sister was eating or my parents were eating or whatever.
Freedom.
And so exactly. And so I think that was part of the appeal when I was a kid. But also I think it was just, Seattle at the time, which is where I grew up, was going through the very, very beginning stages of a restaurant kind of revolution. And Tom Douglas, who was the owner and operator of Dahlia Lounge from when it opened in 1989, was at the forefront of that. And so I found restaurants, and especially restaurant reviews, as someone who always loved writing and all that as well, and reading, to be fascinating, because I was interested in movie reviews a little bit, but movie reviews, I was never as big into movies as I was into food. And I would read the reviews, and I would be kind of captivated by the whole notion of going to these restaurants, many of which were not places, that I was going to go with my family. They were the nicest restaurants in Seattle, which was not a big part of our dining experience. We did a lot of dining at, diners and stuff like that.
Sure.
And so I kept reading about for years, probably the Dahlia Lounge as sort of the, the iconic or one of the iconic restaurants in Seattle, and I badgered my dad to take me. And he eventually did take me for my birthday, for my 11th birthday. And
Wow.
yeah, it was
Most
great.
kids are going to McDonald's for the Happy Meal. You're going to the
Exactly.
Dahlia Lounge.
Yeah, it does tell, there are these things in my life that are, sort of looking backwards are clues to what I would end up doing professionally and being interested in. And I wish I remembered more about the meal other than just sort of being like, wow, this is kind of the nicest, like, it was a big deal. It was just me and my dad. And, he was very, as I recall, relatively indulgent of me. And I think it kind of tickled our server that, here was a kid whose birthday wish was to go to, as you said, most people expect that, an 11-year-old wants a pizza party or something for his birthday. And that was not me. I mean, I'm sure I had a party as well, but the dinner is what I remember. So I had these, very fond memories of the restaurant, and then eventually then getting to work there, initially starting out as a busser, then eventually as a server, and then as a wine director eventually. It was very, it felt like quite an accomplishment, like like I had, I held similar roles in other restaurants, which I certainly also took great pride in, but doing that at a place that I had, sort of been captivated by since childhood was a cool experience.
That's interesting, a sort of coming home of sorts. And so for those of us who are not familiar with Dahlia Lounge, I take it's one of Seattle's top restaurants?
Well, I hate to say this, but it was. Actually, the company recently announced that it will not be reopening
Oh, no.
after the pandemic. Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, it was a bummer. Not totally a shock. Obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has been hard on all of us and had many, many, lasting effects. And this is one of them. Prior to the pandemic, yes. I mean, I think, this is a big topic and hard to kind of say, but Seattle, the restaurant was open for just over 30 years. And, in its time, it went from being, kind of almost a first of its kind restaurant in Seattle to really emphasize, a lot of fresh local ingredients, to kind of look at combining culinary techniques from different parts of the world. And in a way, I mean, I think, fusion would be kind of the way it was probably referred to in the late 80s, early 90s, to being more of an institution. And that's always a interesting transition for a restaurant to go from being cutting edge to kind of the place that has always been there. But yeah, it was always considered a sort of one of the pillars of the dining scene in Seattle. And so obviously, the news that it was closing, or not reopening, I should say, was certainly sad for a lot of people, but obviously for those of us who work there, particularly, sad.
Absolutely. While we're on that topic, how do you think restaurants, I mean, obviously a lot of restaurants are closing, sadly, people are losing their jobs. Well, how do you think restaurant lists will change as a result of the pandemic? Hopefully we get to a place of everyone vaccinated, herd immunity, and places reopen, but what do you think of the permanent ramifications of how restaurant lists will look in the future?
Now that's a fascinating question and one I think a lot about. So I will give you my informed speculation. Let's put it that way. I think that one of the biggest changes that we will see, well, I think there's two big changes that we will see. One is going to be that restaurants are going to have to strongly reconsider, and here I'm speaking, I think, for me here in the United States, I think that this format is largely the same in Canada. Other parts of the world have different, this is not going to apply to as much because I don't know as much about how these things work. But traditionally in restaurants, the profit driver for restaurants is the beverage alcohol program, is wine, cocktails, beer.
Yeah.
And
they say customers will eat you poor and drink you rich. I don't know if that still applies, but yeah. Exactly.
Well, and so I think that, but if you compare that to the world, like in Europe, for example, the model for restaurants is a little different. The wine generally, beverage alcohol more broadly, is not marked up the same way that it is here. There's also a lot less intermediaries, especially, in Europe between winery and restaurant. In many cases, restaurants can buy directly from the winery, which keeps costs down. Here in the U.S., if you're in Washington State, you can buy direct from some Washington wineries if you're a restaurant. But the point is that, there is less of a there's so much in the past of the revenue of the restaurant came through the beverage alcohol program. And I think the thought process, some of that just kind of came to be naturally. And I think the sort of consistent theme was, well, drinking is an option for people. So if people we don't want everyone to feel priced out because they don't want to spend money on alcohol. They can still come in and have a meal. Right. But what we found in restaurants, this was all happening before the pandemic. The pandemic has just caused a reset and a chance to reevaluate a lot of these things. What we found is that the real problem with that model is, well, for one, obviously, if people don't drink, then that's a problem for you. And it starts as prices of everything creep up, and in alcohol, as with everything else, you start to run into this problem where either you are putting a lot of your program, your list, out of almost everyone's price point. And if you have a very wealthy clientele, maybe that's okay. But for the most part, what restaurants are finding, what I was finding is, the wine I was excited about that I wanted to share with guests, not all of it, but a lot of it was starting to kind of creep up into a price point where it was harder and harder to do that. And why? Because, well, typically we were marking up, that's our standard markup in the US of, 3 times the wholesale price for a bottle of wine, 4 times the wholesale price for a glass of wine. Like that was the very standard format, and obviously deviate from that in certain places. And what I wonder if what will happen is restaurants will say, bars will say, et cetera, wine inventory is costly. Wine is expensive to store. It's big. It's expensive to buy. Right. So having a large program that most of which doesn't sell very regularly, just so that you have a full looking list, or just so that you have expensive bottles on hand when that guest does come in, is that our most efficient use of resources? Or does it make sense to have a smaller list with less expensive offerings? Maybe we charge less markup and we rely on volume, and we rely maybe on making up that loss of revenue in other ways. And one of them, I think, unfortunately, is going to be much less full service in restaurants. I think that the counter service restaurant is going to be a huge part of the post-pandemic landscape.
And what does that mean, the counter service restaurant? Are you talking about fast food?
Not exactly. I think when I define counter service, what I envision is a sort of model, and it's kind of a catch-all phrase, but what I envision is not what we typically think of as full service, where you walk into a restaurant, someone greets you at the door, they take you to a table, you sit down, a server comes over, takes your order, brings your food, you never have to get up, right? There's no part of the meal where, obviously you can, but there's no part of the meal where anything you need will be brought to you. Mm-hmm. And counter service in my eyes means more like you walk in, there's a line, or there's a counter, or you have an app on your phone or something. You sit down and maybe sit down at a table and you scan a QR code on your phone and you place your order through your phone. In other words, You're cutting out a couple of jobs, basically. You're taking the server, the host, maybe even the busser, maybe when you're done, someone brings your food to you probably. Maybe you go pick it up at a counter, but maybe they bring it to you. But then when you're done, you bus your own table to bus tub, tray, whatever. Right. And what I think we were already seeing that in Seattle and in a lot of other places pre-pandemic. And what I think we'll see post-pandemic is that labor is such an incredibly high cost for restaurants, and it's become more and more so. And for a lot of good reasons, because people, paying minimum wage in the United States for skilled labor just is not it's a hard job. All parts of it are hard. Cooking is very hard, long hours, it's intense work, and paying people essentially minimum wage or just above it to do that is just not you're not going to keep talent, and people don't want to do that job, and I don't blame them. It's hard work, and it's skilled work, and it should be paid as such. Right. But the reality is you can't, you still need generally people to prepare food in restaurants, and most of them. But how much do you really need people to take orders and serve food? Well, I don't know. Mm-hmm. So one way for restaurants to get around this problem of, keeping wine prices approachable to people is to cut the service component. Mm-hmm. So that's a thing that I anticipate being different. I think the other thing that I'm not sure about, but, we also, again, a thing that we were seeing in a lot of restaurants all over the U.S. were a lot of wine lists that were very, very, very narrowly focused. And I don't know yet whether there will be the same appetite for those things going forward, at least in the next couple of years.
In what way might they be narrowly focused? Like, give us an example of what.
So we're going to only serve wine from, from Burgundy, or we're only going to serve wine from Northern Italy, or we're only going to serve natural wine. And all of those places may still survive in some context, But I think what you often found, and what surprised me too, is that you would see restaurants with, like, it's one thing if you have a restaurant who specializes in Piedmontese cuisine, serving Piedmontese wines. Fine, right? That makes a certain kind of sense,
Sure.
and is, whatever. But what I was seeing a lot of were restaurants that had a little more of a not as clear a geographic origin for their cuisine, but sort of making these choices about a very narrow set of wines, whether regionally or stylistically or whatever. And just, again, like, you kind of create this program where you tell a lot of would-be wine drinkers, hey, we don't really have anything for you. And I just think, I have always thought that's bad business, but in a world where, you're just not sure what the landscape is going to look like as people start to kind of fully reemerge into the world post, vaccination and stuff like that. My inclination, my instinct as a service professional would be to be as accommodating as possible. And that means giving people options when you can, and not being quite as narrow.
Right.
But someone might, people might have a lot of success going the other way. I don't know. It's just speculating.
That's interesting observations. So perhaps less risky or less niche and more recognizable wines, higher rotation, that sort of thing, the things that you've written about previously. Do you think also contributing to this, I was reading something you were writing about that, but perhaps the type of diners who will come out to restaurants post-pandemic will also change in that maybe two specific groups, those with expense accounts, business types with expense accounts, and maybe large event traffic or sporting event traffic. I'm not sure what it was, but do you think those two groups will diminish considerably and have a result or have a big impact on restaurant lists?
Yes. I think one of the big unknown questions for not just the restaurant industry, but the travel industry, hotel industry, things like that is, business travel has been largely ground to a halt during the pandemic.
Right.
Some small amount of quote unquote essential travel, but the kinds of things, whether it's an individual or a small group from a company traveling to some other part of the country or the world for business, large conventions, like, all those things are not really happening right now. Mm-hmm. And I think what we're finding, what I suspect is being found, and my wife works for a Big Four accounting firm, so I have, a certain insight into how that all works, just in terms of hearing what she and the partners at her firm are discussing about, all of that in some way, is that, what's been clear is, like, so much of business can be conducted like this, virtually, in a way that now that everyone basically has spent a year or more adapting to it, is not going to go away. Right. That the idea of getting on a plane and flying for X number of hours in business class and staying in an expensive hotel and staying and paying for meals, if it doesn't go away entirely, is going to be greatly diminished. And the reality is that a lot of restaurants, especially in downtown cores and big cities, rely heavily on that kind of business. That is the bread and butter of a lot of restaurants. I think about many big steakhouses and steakhouse chains are built around the premise in part that, like, we are going to have a core level of business that is someone who's going to walk in and who in the end of it isn't paying, so they don't really care. Maybe they have a budget they have to keep under, but it's not their money. So yeah, they'll buy a $100 steak and a $300 bottle of wine and not even think about it. Sure. And if it's their own money, well, maybe they don't do that. Maybe they get the burger and maybe they get a beer, right?
Or maybe
and those
they're
things
tourists visiting a big city and they're going to splurge a little bit,
Yes. And that piece of it, I think the tourism side we will see. Okay. But, underpinning a lot of these industries is business travel, because business travel is not as, it's changed a lot. It used to be even more of a free-for-all, because within the U.S., the tax laws were different, and you could sort of write off on your taxes larger amounts of business entertaining expenses. Okay. But even so, it's been relatively permissive, and it's just been a thing that is done. But again, so many things after this pandemic, we're going to say, well, just because we did it that way doesn't mean we should continue to do it that way. Right. Unclear. Yeah. So I think you have that piece of it, where a lot of businesses that depended on business travel, and to some extent, maybe just overall business traffic. So even if it's not travel, but it's people working in office buildings, again, unclear how much of that is going to resume at full capacity. I think for a foreseeable future, I think there's going to be, half occupancies, some people are going to be given the option to kind of permanently work from home if they choose to. So you're just going to have a lot fewer people in these downtown areas for the next couple of years, which creates real pressure on restaurants that are in those areas. Obviously, not all restaurants are in those areas. And then the other piece of it is, in terms of these large events, that I think we're seeing coming back. I mean, you already see, sporting events in the United States, certainly, and depending on where you are, with very different sets of rules and regulations, but with some number of fans in attendance. I imagine that as the year wears on, you will see you might see large outdoor concerts, those kinds of things that do bring people in will probably come back quicker. They've been more of an issue for restaurants that were dependent on them during the pandemic when they've been shut down. I think that will come back because people are so desperate to have things to do and to be in community with one another.
Yes.
But it's the business travel piece that I'm dubious will return to anything like its pre-pandemic level, at least for a number of years.
Well, that's interesting. So you had been a wine director and sommelier at Dahlia Lounge pre-pandemic. Can you remember the day you first thought your job might be in jeopardy?
I can. I'll tell you there are two.
Okay.
So the first day that really stands out to me in memory was February 29th of
You've got
2020.
the date.
I do. Well, it was a leap year day, so it's a sort of not a lot of February 29ths.
Right.
And the reason for it is that was a Saturday night, and I showed up to the restaurant as I usually do, between noon and 1, kind of getting ready for the day and for the service. And the news had come out earlier that morning that the first person, so the Seattle area was one of the initial epicenters for COVID-19 outbreaks in the U.S. and in particular in a care facility in Kirkland, which is nearby a city. And the first person at one of those care facilities had died that morning, or had died the night before, and it was announced that morning. Wow. And I noticed, just being in the restaurant and being around, taking some phone calls, that probably 20 to 25% of our reservations canceled for that night. And it was the first time that we really had seen and not every person said, oh, this is because of COVID or coronavirus. I think at the time, no one was calling it COVID. No one really said that at the time. I mean, one or two people maybe said it, but it was clear, we don't just get a quarter of our reservations canceling without anything besides a big weather event, or in this case, a disease. And so that was the first moment where I was like, oh, wow, the restaurant was not empty or anything. We still did a reasonable amount of covers, but it was, less than a typical Saturday. And again, you get those people calling and canceling, you notice that. And then the subsequent week was pretty slow, which can sometimes happen in early March. And then it was really the next weekend and that following week. So sort of the 7th, 8th, 9th of March, where, suddenly we were doing, 25, 35 covers in a 175 seat restaurant.
Wow. And,
by Monday of that week, Tuesday of that week, it was clear. I mean, this just can't go on, right? We cannot be open. There's no level of staffing that makes this, you have to have a few cooks because, you have to have a menu, and, it just was, and it was clear, people are not going to be, even before anything had been announced from the government side, it was clear people were taking it upon themselves to stay home. I mean, the big employers in downtown Seattle had, by this point, a lot of them had sort of issued work from home orders, or were encouraging people to work from home. It just was, there was no, it was clear there was less and less traffic. And actually, I had been gifted from the company well before a night, so that one of our restaurants was in a hotel in downtown Seattle, and it had sort of been gifted a dinner for two, and sort of a fancy date night. And so my wife and I on March 10th went to dinner. There were 2 other tables in the restaurant.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah. And we stayed at the hotel, and kind of is this a good idea? But we all look back in that period of time, and most of us, I think, can think wow, I did some really dumb things and didn't really realize. And so the next morning, woke up and we had breakfast, and my wife went to work, and I went and stopped in the restaurant, and I was like, I don't think I don't know if I'm going to have a meal in a restaurant again for a while. Whether or not I was comfortable with it, it was also just, no one is going to operate. And that later that day, the company announced that we were intending to close all the restaurants for service, that's after service that Sunday. And by the time we actually got to Sunday, the governor of Washington announced that all restaurants had to close that day. When the news came on Wednesday, the 11th, it felt wow, we're out in front of this. And 4 days later, it was everyone is, it just, that period of time Yeah, it's like I'm sure everyone remembers that period of time was just like everything was accelerating. It was really crazy to live through, and we'll all remember it in one way or another. So yeah, that was like it was strange.
Oh my goodness. So everyone was furloughed. And so, I mean, you've made quite the pivot, or perhaps you were always doing content creation, you're writing podcast. I know you have, you had the Disgorged podcast, which does that still, do you still do that as well?
Goodish question. I mean, I'll sort of give the very brief background. So I went to college and got a degree in broadcast journalism, and actually was much more interested when I was younger in, I'd always been interested in food and drink, but I never thought about, I thought if I was going to have a career in that, it was going to be in restaurants.
Okay.
And I thought about doing that. But I also was really interested in journalism and especially sports journalism. And that was really what I did in college. And so after graduating, or kind of at the time of graduation, I was, looking at options career-wise and had a few job offers. I went to college in New York City and I had a few job offers there. But the reality is that, those jobs were, how would I describe it? They were not intended for people who had to actually like pay to live in New York City.
Right.
Like most of the people who took them were people who were from the area and lived at home.
Sure.
I had a couple of friends who were from the New York City area and took jobs like that, and they lived with their parents for years until they could actually like make enough money to rent an apartment. And from Seattle, I didn't have parents to stay with there. So the salary they paid was just, I did the math and it was like, I would have, essentially, even if I got the cheapest apartment I could reasonably see, I would essentially have no money. I would have enough to pay my rent and my student loans, and I would have like $100 a month for food.
Woohoo.
And it's just like, you just can't, it was
Can't
like, I'm not,
survive on that.
no. And I just wasn't, I liked what I was doing all right, but I wasn't so passionate about it that the years of kind of, barely getting by were appealing to me. And so I moved back to Seattle and started working in restaurants instead. And all that to say, for a while, I kind of, the journalism side of things kind of lay dormant for me. But then I got into writing about the restaurant industry in Seattle. I wrote for a publication here for a number of years called Seattle Weekly. And that was, I ended up eventually having a weekly drinks column, kind of talking about things going on in the beverage alcohol world here. And in that period, at some point when I had sort of been doing a lot of writing, and I had done a podcast way back in the early days of podcasting in the mid 2000s, a sports podcast with some college friends. And we did it for a little while, but this was an era when you recorded a podcast and you uploaded it to a website, and no one had iPhones. I mean, you told people, if you want to listen to it, you can go to this URL and sit at your computer and listen to it or something.
Right.
It's just not a thing that people did at the time, including me. I didn't really, I listened to maybe one podcast occasionally. And so what happened was I was, doing some writing, and then I was invited to be on a radio show talking about wine by someone, a colleague. And I was like, oh, I miss this. I miss talking about wine and beverage alcohol. I enjoy writing about it as well, but there's something about talking about it that fits me in a lot of ways. And so I said, whatever, I'm going to go start my own podcast, and I'm just going to interview people that I like or that I'm interested in what they have to say. And so I started, that was Disgorged, and I recorded a number of episodes, and just was sort of like, I'm going to, some combination of people that I knew and people I was interested in, and just sent them emails and said, hey, would you do this? And one of those people was Adam Teeter, who's the co-founder of VinePair and my co-host on the podcast.
Right.
And he and I had a really interesting conversation on my podcast. And I sort of afterwards, after a little while, was like, hey, VinePair doesn't have a podcast. Our conversation was great. Do you want to do this? And he said, oh, that's an interesting idea. We've sort of been thinking about it. Let me get back to you. So like 2 months later, I emailed him and was like, hey, what do you think about doing a podcast? And this went on for about a year before we finally actually got to the point where we were actually clearly going to do it. And so we started recording, and when we really started doing the VinePair podcast, I kind of put Disgorged on hold. But actually, very recently, in the last little while, I've been doing these through Disgorged because my life is always I like to have different things going on. I've never been just a one job at a time person. Yeah. And certainly with the pandemic and with the restaurants closing, that's been good because I had at the time other things lined up, and I've been able to focus on them more. So I've been doing classes and events online through Disgorged, and then have been turning the salons, which are conversational, kind of like this, into podcasts. So actually, there are some new things under the Disgorged feed as of like this last week,
Yes.
which is cool. So that'll be every other week for as long as I do the salons. We'll just put the audio up. So yeah,
You had that to
I don't know, that was
return
a lot.
to, like after the pandemic hit and you were no longer the wine director. That was no longer a possibility. But what do you think other sommeliers are doing these days? I mean, you're fortunate; you have the skills, the content creation, journalism background. But what are sommeliers doing who have been laid off and don't have those skills?
I think that's a really good question and a hard one to answer, because I think there are very few good answers. I mean, in terms of ones that are supportive and positive for them.
Right.
I know some people who have, frankly, tried to create content in one form or another, who have leaned into social media, have started podcasts and things like that, trying to get that connection, that rolling. I think the hard part is, if you don't already have a following, it can be hard to generate one,
Right.
generally.
Yes.
I think some have, one of the things that we saw earlier in the pandemic was a lot of restaurants that had, elaborate or extensive wine programs looking to, clear out inventory. So maybe they kept the sommelier on or the wine director on, or brought them back in a limited capacity to try and, facilitate either retail sales of wine or maybe sales to collectors or things like that.
Sure.
But again, that was, more like, April, May, June, not so much this, a year later. Some of them have undoubtedly either left the hospitality industry. They've maybe been able to find some kind of jobs within other parts of the wine industry. But I know a lot of them have at least for the time being, had to leave wine or beverage alcohol because, so much of what people are doing now in terms of purchasing wine is either online, which doesn't typically require a lot of, human labor, especially skilled labor, or they are buying it from grocery stores or retail shops, many of which are, already fully staffed. So, I mean, I don't know. I think one of the big casualties or one of the big impacts of this pandemic on the hospitality industry is going to be a tremendous talent drain, especially probably both front and back of the house, because people have had to find other lines of work. They've had to do something besides restaurant work because it's just not there. And even if you're working in a restaurant that is open in some capacity, again, I think wine professionals have been, it's been always in hard times have been some of the first kind of jobs to go, right? The owner, whether it's an individual owner, a company, whatever, figures, and maybe rightly so, yeah, great. It's nice to have a sommelier or a wine director or, whatever, when times are good. But when times are bad or when they're hard or we're just unsure, we can pay a manager who's already being paid a salary. They can handle the wine, right? They can order it. They can just reorder wine. Yeah, they can stock the wine. They can, whatever, and we'll just make it do. And so I think that we're going to see that there's going to be a real dearth of jobs for people like me, frankly, when restaurants do fully reopen. And I hope I'm wrong. I mean, I hope that there is a recognition that there is a place for skilled professionals in these niche areas. But, you can't really, it requires, I've seen the argument put out there, and I don't know that I can totally endorse it, which is that, wine directors and sommeliers pay for themselves. And I think they can, for sure, if they're good. But there are also, the reality is, like, we were having a glut of people of my general skill set certainly in the United States, as wine education and wine accreditation became more and more popular. You had more and more people floating around with the accreditation at a minimum, whether they had relevant experience, harder to say. And, how many restaurants really need a dedicated wine professional? And I think the answer pre-pandemic was maybe fewer than had them, and certainly post-pandemic for a while. I think it's going to be, fine dining restaurants will want them. Maybe some places that have, for one reason or another, an extensive wine program will have them. But I think it's going to be slow to come back, unfortunately.
I agree.